bet you didn't know that there was a European-only PC-exclusive Hellboy game, did you? Hellboy Dogs of the Night is a 2000 third-person action game developed and published by Cryo Studios and released exclusively in Europe, exclusively on the PC. This video is not only a story about a strange little French PC game, but it's also something of a cautionary tale about a bold developer whose reach, unfortunately, exceeded their grasp. To give you the absolute briefest history of the developer, Paris-based Cryo Interactive are probably most famous for their early 90s point-and-click adventure games. Specifically, the game which put them on the map is their second game ever, Dune. Dune was an absolute banger in its day, and even today it's considered a real milestone in the adventure game movement. Now, after Dune did so well, Cryo just started banging out games at a rate which would make Stephen King look like a slacker. Releasing 5-6 games a year, Cryo were doing extremely well in Europe, but really what they were looking to do was to increase their standing on the world stage. This eventually led to a meeting between the co-founder of Cryo, Jean-Michel Lefranc, and the founder of Dark Horse Comics, Mike Richardson. US-based Dark Horse Comics were a pretty big name in the comics game. They were publishing licensed titles like RoboCop, Aliens, Star Wars, but they also had a raft of their own original comic book IPs as well. Dark Horse were interested in entering the interactive space, and in Cryo they saw a partner not only with passion and with talent, but crucially someone with a track record of success. Dark Horse were hoping to leverage Cryo's pretty impressive experience in developing licensed games, and so the first Dark Horse Cryo collaboration, which got greenlit, was an adventure game based on the Aliens comic book. This was then shortly followed by a shooter based on Frank Miller's Hard Boiled. The success of these first two games saw the success of Dark Horse computer games taking off. Dark Horse were really excited to grow this relationship further, but unfortunately Dark Horse were based in Oregon and Cryo were based in Paris. So the idea was soon floated to start a small studio stateside, which would allow the two companies to work together more closely. Cryo and Dark Horse together founded Dark Horse Interactive, with both parties fronting up half the cash. The newly founded DHI wanted to adapt another Dark Horse comic book property, and after flirting with adaptations based on Grendel, Out of the Vortex, and even Barbed Wire, the ensemble team at Cryo and Dark Horse eventually agreed that an adaptation of Mike Mignola's Hellboy would be the first game developed under the DHI banner. Again, with the brief history. Created in 1993, Hellboy is a noir-inspired comic book about a demonic paranormal investigator who really hates the Nazis. The comic book combined elements of real European mythology, pulp-era superheroes, and classic American horror literature. If you need to know more than that, then go check out Matt Draper. He's way better at this than I am, and I couldn't even hope to hold a candle to his work. At this point in time, there had only been 2 6-issue arcs of the comic and a couple of one-shots, so it's not like there was a huge amount of source material to draw from. But even in those early days, Dark Horse were already optioning Hellboy to be made into a Hollywood film, so it kind of made sense from their perspective to get a game out at the same time. The kind of games that Cryo were known for at this point in time, like these French-style adventure games, were a perfect fit for the Hellboy IP. These games were a little bit slower, with a bit more of a focus on storytelling, on puzzle solving, much more atmosphere, still including a little bit of combat and survival stuff. My mate over at Indigo Gaming mentioned that there was an air of magic about this era of 90s Franco adventure games, and he's absolutely right. On paper, the marriage of Cryo Studios and Dark Horse Comics is a perfect combination. And so Hellboy Dogs of the Night would be Cryo's most ambitious game to date. Slated for release on PC and PlayStation, Dogs of the Night was going to be a moody, atmospheric action-adventure game, taking inspiration from contemporary 3D adventure games like Resident Evil and Tomb Raider. Production started in Paris in 1996. The core team at Cryo had worked on Ubik, on Atlantis, some of them had worked all the way back to Dune. The team was headed up by Olivier Lebourg, who'd been with the company since the early 90s. Lebourg had worked on the Grendel pitch, and he'd also led the production on Out of the Vortex, and he'd been a key part of building the relationship between Cryo and Dark Horse, so he was the logical choice to take the helm on Hellboy. I reached out to Olivier, and he was kind enough to come back to me and answer a lot of questions that I had about this, and he really helped the story of this video come together. Dark Horse were essentially hoping that Hellboy was going to be the next big name in the 3D adventure game. and so Hellboy got the biggest budget of any Cryo game so far. The game's assets and cutscenes were created on cutting-edge silicon graphics machines using software which is better known for Hollywood films than it was for making computer games. Cryo were also intent on throwing a lot of money into the development of the game's in-house 3D engine. At the end of the day, these guys were aiming to knock Tomb Raider off of the top spot. Not long into the development, Dark Horse decided that it would be better if they had more direct control over the management of this project, and so they pushed to relocate the Cryo team from their offices in Paris to Dark Horse's offices in Portland, Oregon. Top-level production management would still be overseen by Cryo's team based in Paris, but the actual development would be undertaken in the US, overseen by Lebourg, but funded directly by Dark Horse Comics. As you can probably imagine, moving the entire team to America was a pretty big hurdle for delivering this project. Everything from applying to work visas, finding apartments, all the other accoutrements that come with moving your life 5,000 miles. It took a lot of resources out of this project, and it saw the development of the game substantially pushed back. Olivier actually spoke extremely highly about Dark Horse's understanding during this time. No doubt it was stressed on everybody, but Dark Horse helped out anywhere they could. I imagine actually this would have been a real bonding experience for the Cryo team, leaving their old lives behind to move over to the land of opportunity, all that camaraderie and forging of bonds between these guys. I think it's cool. Once the team was settled in Portland, Lebourg was then tasked with bolstering the existing Cryo team with domestic US staff. And Olivier said it was hard to bring people to Portland back then, so they had to hire mostly locally. This resulted in the majority of the American team having very little experience in games development, if any at all. Dark Horse were making a massive commitment to getting this studio up and running, and Lebourg's team were doing everything they could to keep everything rolling. Lebourg himself, in fact, rolled up his sleeves, not only worked on producing the game, but he also worked on the game design, he wrote the concept, and he co-wrote the story and the dialogue with help from Mike Mignola himself. The game is set in what was then called Czechoslovakia, sometime in the 1960s. Hellboy and Sarah are investigating a missing BPRD agent when Sarah herself gets kidnapped by mysterious forces. It's then up to HB to find out who took her, where they took her, and why they took her. And so he winds up in an insane asylum, and I can't remember why, but it turns out that the guy who owns the insane asylum is using the inmates to open up a portal to hell. Every 666 years, nice, the barrier between hell and earth wears thin, and there's this evil cult who've been trying to break into hell all through the centuries, and for some reason Hellboy ends up getting sent back 666 years into the past to retrieve a sacred amulet that will prevent the lad in the present from doing the thing. And then there's a load of sewers, and there's something about a dragon, but I think you can figure out the rest, right? It's not exactly Hugo award-winning fiction, but considering it borrows nothing from the comic books, I actually think this is pretty decent. It pulls from the exact same pulpy roots that inspired Hellboy in the first place. It's got your underground cults, mystical amulets, gateways to hell. I think considering the circumstances, they did a pretty bang-up job with this story. Not only that, but Dark Horse doubled down on this, and they forked out for some pretty top-tier voice acting, which honestly elevates that writing even more. Big Red is voiced by David Gassman. Gassman is a big name in Franco games. His most famous role is probably Rayman. It's that or Paige from Beyond Good and Evil. He's lent his voice to everything from Twinson in Little Big Adventure to Ed Carnby in Alone in the Dark. Honestly, you couldn't find a better fit for a lead in this type of game. And he's a pretty good Hellboy as well. I don't know how much direction he was actually given, but he nails that blasé, blue-collar vibe that's just so essential for Hellboy. He's the first person to ever voice Hellboy, and he knocks it out of the park on his first attempt. That's amazing, especially when you consider he's got nothing to base his performance off of. Is he as good as Ron Perlman? Well, let's be honest, no he's not, but how could you expect to be as good as Ron Perlman? By the way, did you know Ron Perlman was the voice of Orion in Justice League? The rest of the supporting cast is divided up between Gassman and another fella called Alan Wenger. Both Gassman and Wenger are consistent voices in Franco adventure games. They've both starred in things like Outcast, Siberia, Dark Earth, Omicron, in fact all of the David Cage games really, and they're both absolutely fantastic. There are exactly 2 female characters in this entire game. One of them is Hellboy's partner Sarah, who gets kidnapped in the first 5 minutes, and the other one is this demented nurse who Hellboy throws out of a window. How's that for your representation, huh?
All right then.
Both of these roles are voiced by Sharon Mann. Much like Gassman and Wenger, Sharon Mann is also a big name in Franco adventure games. To me, she's best known as Kate Walker from the Siberia franchise. There's not exactly a lot for me to critique here because she's got about 12 lines in the game, but I think she does a pretty good job. Considering that great writing and great voice acting were one of those emerging pillars in PC games at the time, I take this as a sign that Dark Horse were really following Cryo's lead. They were letting them create the game that they wanted to make. When you look back at games from this era and you think about what it takes for us to consider a game a classic, a game needed to really have three things: great dialogue, good puzzle solving, and decent combat. Cryo were off to a cracking start already with their Hellboy adventure game, and Dark Horse were backing them all the way. Puzzles are also good. They are very good. There's plenty of puzzles to solve in the game. They're all different and they're all actually kind of smart. Cryo here are clearly flexing their adventure game experience. Some of the puzzles are your Monkey Island, Peter to Paul style item quests, but others are really great little head scratchers. This puzzle, right at the beginning of the game, it just sets the bar for the rest of the experience. To raise this bridge, Hellboy needs to weigh down each pillar with a stone of the appropriate mass. You're given just enough clues to figure it out. It doesn't hold your hand and it doesn't take all day to solve it. None of the puzzles in this game really are massively obtuse. You just need to apply a little bit of logic. If anything, I would have liked to have seen more puzzles in Hellboy. The puzzle sections are some of the best bits in the game, some of the bits I enjoyed the most, and I would have liked to have seen DHI really dig down into that expertise that Cryo were bringing to the table. Decent dialogue, a good focus on puzzle solving. To become an all-time classic adventure game like Alone in the Dark, Tomb Raider or Dark Earth, then you need to have little spats of combat, and that final pillar is unfortunately where Hellboy Dogs of the Night takes a bit of a nosedive. The puzzles and the dialogue could have been invested into more, right? Fine. The combat though is just terrible. Even for me, and I try to find positivity in everything, but the collision detection is terrible. Half of your hits will miss automatically. I've never hit anything with the gun at all, so after about an hour I just stopped using it. I played the entire game just by punching everything. In fairness, none of the combat encounters are that hard. None of the enemies are so tough that you're going to be stuck on them for long, which thematically is good. That's how it should be. Hellboy shouldn't be getting stomped on by some poser in a dressing gown. But what could be these short, punchy little spats ended up just feeling a little bit dull. It feels like a work in progress, but it didn't really ever get the attention it required. After a couple of hours of playing, I found myself just running around the enemies. I wasn't even fighting them because it just isn't very fun to do. The game's bosses are largely bad as well, I'm afraid, but I did have a lot of fun fighting this giant monkey. It's thematically very appropriate. Giant monkeys are a bit of a staple in Hellboy. The comic books are full of them, and it was a real laugh here. You can see that it's a bit crap, but I did have fun wailing on this guy, and also Hellboy says the line.
That's it for you, pal.
I've watched and read a fair few reviews of this game online, and most of them lament the kind of slow, plodding tank controls. Now, if you're an old fogey like me, then you'll remember that fixed camera angles and tank controls are a staple of this genre. I actually kind of like the slow controls. Classic adventure games like Alone in the Dark and Dark Earth also use fixed camera angles, not just because of the limitations of the time, but also because it made the game feel quite cinematic. Maybe using pre-rendered backgrounds here might have helped the game age a bit better, but the slow pace of the gameplay puts the onus on exploration and on atmosphere, which is exactly the right approach for a Hellboy game. In fact, tonally, I think Hellboy Dogs of the Night is spot on. That slow pace, that focus on exploring these crumbly old ruins and dilapidated old churches, I think that is just right out of the comic pages. And I'm going to go out there and I'm going to say actually the sound and music are probably the most standout items for me. Gilles Civioto created a wicked soundtrack for this game. Super atmospheric, fits the mood tremendously. Considering this guy hadn't done a huge amount of work before, Hellboy is a real knockout soundtrack. The art direction might be a bit of a deviation from the source material, but the colour palette really gives off a similar vibe to the comic book. Just take a look at my captures folder, look at the way all these thumbnails, they just all work together. That's got to be something that was considered during development. Yeah, the blocky graphics are a little bit crap, but that's never been a big deal on this channel. Being objective, for the time, these graphics, yes, they would have been a bit ropey, so we can say without a doubt that Hellboy would have been an ugly game on release, but honestly, everything else in this game could have easily made up for that. There's no reason this game couldn't have been a banger. But the unfortunate reality is Hellboy Dogs of the Night took 4 years to develop. For the 90s, that is outrageous. Games typically took about a year to make back then, with teams a lot smaller than the team at Dark Horse Interactive. 2 years into the development, Cryo knew something was up. Dark Horse's inexperience in this arena had seen them splurging way more time, way more money on this project than they should have, but Cryo, they knew better. Friction between the French and the US team just increased over time as Cryo just started increasing pressure on this team to get the game out of the door. I didn't press Olivier for a huge amount of details on this, but I can imagine those Cryo lads thinking that they're the only ones who knew what they were doing. But I can also empathise with this US team who have been injected into this and are railing against this team who bonded so strongly over moving to America. Tension continued mounting until eventually members of the French team actually quit and they started moving home. With those all-star Cryo members gone, it was actually the remnants of that inexperienced US team that got this game finished and got Hellboy over the line. The PC version of Hellboy Dogs of the Night was finally released in Europe in Christmas 2000. PC Gamer UK gave it 14 out of 100. The PC version has 11.5% on game rankings. The announced PlayStation port was shelved indefinitely. Although they had started on their next game, the North American team never really recovered from Hellboy's failure. The team was disillusioned, Cryo were having financial issues, the world was suffering from a global recession, and I think everybody just agreed that the time was right just to dissolve the whole venture. For a lot of people, Hellboy Dogs of the Night was the first and last game they ever worked on. What probably started out feeling like a dream job eventually probably felt like a waking nightmare toward the end. In the time it had taken to make Hellboy, Cryo themselves had published about 30 other games. Hellboy Dogs of the Night isn't a bad PC game. It is a bad PC game for its year of release. If Dogs of the Night had come out in 1997, I think it would have stood a fair chance. But that painful, drawn-out development process just saw the game hitting shelves way too late. Spider-Man and Tony Hawk's were ripping up consoles in the year 2000, and PC gamers had games like Deus Ex and Hitman. Olivier told me that the team even knew the game was going to be bad when it came out. They knew they were behind the curve, but I fully respect the fact that they just pushed on and they got this game shipped. The fact that this game crossed the line, in my opinion, is the happy ending. And that is what this video is all about. Against it all, against all that adversity, all that drama, the people at Cryo, Dark Horse Interactive, whatever, they pulled on their welly boots, they waded out into the mud, and they got this game finished. It's so easy just to heap scorn on games like this, just to do a Nelson Muntz and go, ha ha,
this game bad.
But nobody sets out to make a bad game. Behind every failure is a story of brave creators putting their heart and soul and years of effort into a thing. And there is now something where before there was nothing. I always try to remember that and to try to appreciate why something didn't go right instead of just pointing fingers and making snide jokes. Teddy Roosevelt got it right when he said, "It's not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man in the arena." There's no shame in coming up short. At any point, DHI could have just jacked it in, but they didn't. They got it finished. There's no better happy ending than that. Hellboy Dogs of the Night isn't just a cautionary tale of a publisher not understanding the market they're getting into. This is a story of struggle, and of triumph, and of daring greatly. Thank you very much for watching. I had such a good time putting this video together, and thank you so much to Olivier for answering all my questions and really helping the story of this come together. I hope you enjoyed watching it just as much as I enjoyed making it, and if you want to watch more videos about old PC games, then please subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again soon for another episode. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers.